Chapter 12, Ancient Empires, Ancient Gods. So we're moving into our time period chapters now. So we're moving truly into a discussion of art history or the story of art. So we originally were moving through like how to appreciate art, how to understand how it's designed, the different mediums. And now we're going to be truly looking at, for the rest of the course, the story of art. Obviously, some of the story will be a bit truncated because you're in an art appreciation class, and unfortunately, we only have limited time to deal with a lot of these topics. For instance, I have an Art History 1 class and an Art History 2 class that deal with the entire survey of this material on a much larger scale. So if there's certain things you don't see, I apologize. But again, you are going to be having a little bit of a more truncated sort of storyline, unfortunately. But you can always email me if you have any questions about other pieces. I'm happy to fill in the blanks if you have interest there. So the first thing I wanted to show you was a map of what we call the ancient civilizations, looking at the areas of Africa, Europe, and Asia during the time period around the year 2000 to 4000 BC. We really often put a time marker of 4000 BC on the beginning of culture. So that's something to keep in mind, that we really talk about the year 4000 BC as the beginning of culture. And by the way, I still say BC because it's just how I learned it. But you'll notice that BCE is probably how you have learned it. So again, it's just a habit of mine to say BC AD. But, please feel free to use the updated nomenclature there. It's perfectly acceptable. It's actually very acceptable. So again, it's just something I do because it's a habit. If you look at the map, though, you'll notice various cultures, from the early Chinese culture to Indian culture to Mesopotamian culture to Egyptian culture. One thing I hope you notice is, as you look at where these cultures are at, you'll notice they all have one thing in common, which is an available water source of some kind. So if you look, for instance, at Egypt, let's go to Egypt and look here, Northern Africa, right? Egypt. Notice the Nile River is what is their lifeblood. Then you can go over to China over here, and you can consider the fact that the Yellow and the Yangtze River in China was their lifeblood to create their culture. So you'll notice what's shared is a river, right? Everybody needs a river in order for their culture to begin. So we'll begin with Egypt and talk a bit about some of the common themes that you might see in early Egyptian culture. And as always, I love to show you a map to give you a sense of where you are. Egypt's a rather special culture, of course, because it's an unbroken historical culture. It still is a cultural entity today. And so from the year 4000 BC up to the year, today, they are still there. They're still Egyptian. So that's quite a special thing. As I mentioned before, you'll see the Nile River, right, as what their culture is centered around. Egypt is also interesting because it's often talked about as a Western culture, even though it's located on the continent of Africa. So there is this weird duality that Egypt has, where it's discussed as a Western culture, but they are Africans. But again, most African cultures are discussed as non-Western. So again, it's intriguing to consider how these ideas get started. Mainly it's because how we've decided to label them, right? But again, it's an interesting problem with Egyptian culture. I always tell my students that the reason why we understand something about these cultures is because they wrote. Your book does not have time to cover prehistory, but prehistory is where you see cave paintings, Stonehenge, right? And they're prehistoric because they didn't write. They didn't write things down. We don't know what they were thinking. Early cultures like Mesopotamians, Egyptians, and you also notice your book doesn't have time to cover Mesopotamia, but you'll notice these early cultures have writing. In the case of Egyptians, it's hieroglyphs, and you'll notice that the word literally means holy writing. And it's what we call a pictograph system. It uses pictures to connote meaning. We, by the way, if you're speaking and writing in English, you're using a phonetic system developed by the Phoenicians, which uses sounds to create words. So we use a different system than the pictographic system that you see here. But if you think about early communication, pictures would have been easier than phonetics. So even though pictures would be translated to phonetic sounds, that's just, they didn't think about language like we do. They think about it first as pictures, as an easy way to communicate to people. Then the way it sounds different, but the phonics of it are different. So, by the way, most early languages are pictographic systems, such as hieroglyphic language. And the Rosetta Stone, of course, is the famous key that helped us unlock the hieroglyphs because it had 3 different texts on it. And one of them was hieroglyphs, and one of them was Greek. Because we knew what the Greeks said, we could translate what the hieroglyphs said. So the Rosetta Stone is like a key that unlocks language. Pretty cool. Now, Egyptians, what they're most known for, of course, are their burials. And so I always say that if you had to think of a culture having like a slogan or a bumper sticker, right? Something short and simple, easily communicate to you what they're all about. Egyptians would say, we live to die, because they did. They lived to die. Everything about their culture supports the afterlife as the goal that they're looking for, the goal that they're seeking. And so everything revolves around this idea of burials and how to use burials. Now, the kind of burial they use, the earliest burial was what we call the mastaba, or the mastaba. You hear it pronounced both ways. Here's a diagram of it. And you'll notice it's a pretty simple form. It has a flat top, sloped walls. And you'll notice that on the top level that was at the top surface, right, where people could enter and exit, you had like a chapel for offerings and such. Then you'd have the shaft that went down to your burial chamber. This is because Egyptians thought it was important to keep your Ka statue, which you see up here, and your burial, which would have been down here, in 2 separate places because they worried that your burial could be desecrated. So your Ka statue would be where your spirit was, right? And then your body would be somewhere else. So they developed it in that way. So everybody would have had a mastaba, right? The mastaba later would be used to start to create larger burials, such as the step pyramid that we'll talk about next.